An emergency fund is a very important component of the household budget. Being African, an emergency fund is almost compulsory. Therefore, I'll discuss this specific theme in this episode. Personal finance literacy is tailored towards the West. My intention is to put an African spin on this very important concept from an African point of view, so that you and I have more money in the pocket and eventually we can attain financial freedom. For some, financial freedom means retiring early. For others, financial freedom means leaving work and starting entrepreneurship. So what does financial freedom mean for you? I share my views on my journey to personal finance literacy. However, it is important for us to concentrate on our own financial personal journeys with some good research. An emergency fund can be described as the action of setting aside money specifically for unexplained or financial emergencies. So I have used the word action in this definition as the whole concept is based on actions. Therefore, you can't wish for an emergency fund. It can only be done through making the decision, then acting on it. Good actions come from good decisions. Mind you, financial experts attest that if you make good financial decisions, most of the times at least, say 7 or 8 out of 10 times, you will establish a solid financial base and you're most likely to succeed in your financial journey. So it doesn't have to be 100%, but just do it most of the times. When we think about emergencies though, there are a few things that come into mind. These are unemployment, urgent medical procedures, emergency home repairs, unforeseen auto repair, sudden death or disability. Rules of life apply to all of us. However, as I seek the relevance of this from an African point of view, I do speak with a heavy heart, because let's face it, most of our people can't afford an emergency fund at this point, as the majority are thinking of where to get their next meal. There is need to address this disparity of incomes in the motherland, but not having an emergency fund is not unique to Africa. An economic powerhouse, advanced economy such as the USA has this problem as well. A bank survey in 2022 found that nearly 50% of Americans would be able to cover a $1,000 emergency from their savings. So this means half of the American population will not afford to cover a $1,000 emergency. That's mind-blowing. Additionally, in the same study, Americans also complained that current rising inflation meant that they were saving even less, so that number comes down significantly. So Africans are in good company, I would say, but we do not need to keep that company. We can move on from there. But if you're African and in Africa, or you're in the diaspora or an immigrant from other developing nations, your emergency fund is going to look quite different from, say, in comparison to your Western counterparts. Personal finance experts recommend savings equivalent to 6 months cover, but even more than 6 months if you're in the diaspora. Living expenses tucked away in the emergency fund. I think this applies to Westerners in general. The way Western economies are designed, they are able to sustain a large middle class with diverse industries which are able to create employment. Unemployment rates are quite low. This means by the time a student finishes high school, they are able to find some sort of employment of some description, or that children are actually able to join the workforce early on in life and progress from there. Social mobility, where you have children who are expected to be better than their parents, and financial independence is achieved at an early age. But if there is no movement, or the social mobility is reversed, where children do worse than the parents, then you have a serious social and economic problem. In developing economies such as Africa, social mobility does not work that well, for now at least. There are many Africans in the diaspora who are assisting their families back home, as many countries have not achieved this level of financial independence and social mobility of its citizens. Fortunately, life happens. Things to factor in are emergency air tickets for home. God forbid we have to fly back urgently for one reason or the other, which happens a lot. Buying air tickets on a normal trip with extensive planning is already expensive as it is. Getting an emergency air ticket is even more expensive. You buy the tickets at a premium price. Hence, it is important to have more money in the emergency fund. It is also important to keep in mind the fact that when you get there, when you get home, you might be in charge of finances. Doesn't sound right, but this is the culture. It's not as bad as it sounds, but it is important to mitigate these factors that are not common in the West when we talk about personal finances. As I always say, my favorite quote by Steve Jobs is start small, think big. This theory applies to setting up an emergency fund. Don't feel the pressure to set up the emergency fund quick smart. You can build it one step in front of the other. Unless you have the funds available, you can put $1,000 in there. It's up to you. But if you don't have it, well, go slow. Let's go with 6 months cover. Typically, if your household expenses are $2,500 a month, then times that by 6, then you ought to have around $15,000 or whatever currency your money is in. If your household spend more, then you would need to save more. The question is, where should you keep the emergency fund? There is a book by an Australian author called The Barefoot Investor, a very popular book. I did read this book a few years back, and from the book, there was an emphasis of opening multiple bank accounts for various purposes. These days, opening multiple bank accounts is not too difficult. If you live in a place where banking services are easily accessible on the phone, then that won't be a big deal. You can do that at home on your phone. The general advice is to open a specific account and name it emergency fund. I knew you'd know that. A flexible savings account that you can easily access and ought to give you a reasonable interest. I mean, you can't lock away your emergency fund in the first place. Say in an account such as a deposit account that you can't access easily when you are in need, because when an emergency happens, you want the money right now. That's why it's called an emergency fund. But if you're in a country where opening multiple accounts is a hassle, then you could separate this on a piece of paper. Say in most third world countries, most banking services have not yet caught up with the technology to operate in this way. So if you're in Africa, multiple accounts could be a problem unless your country has caught up with the technology. I was listening to Dave Ramsey one day, and a woman had called and said something which changed my attitude towards emergency funds. So she called and she asked how much money should her emergency fund be. She was suggesting that she thought she needed to have a larger fund because she hated her job and her performance wasn't good as a result of that, and she was going to leave her job at some point anyway. How much should she have in her emergency fund? What I got from this conversation was that the woman actually confused what an actual emergency was. From an African point of view, I'm asking a similar question. What is your emergency? Is sickness or helping out a distant relative an emergency? I guess you might want to justify that as an emergency. You have helped someone in the time of need, or you have paid school fees for that distant cousin or a friend. Are all funerals emergencies? The answer to these questions is no. Not all of the issues that I've mentioned are emergencies, but they are rather expectations for us. Part of our culture is to chip in when you can. Our families are community orientated. So the point is, we can't just abandon our culture in pursuit of Western standards. That's why we can't just live like you are in the UK or in the States, do your own thing and your family. It would be prudent then to have a separate fund for issues like this, so you don't get off guard and dip into emergency fund. Now this account will obviously have a much smaller amount. You can add engagements and weddings, because that's what we do at the weekend. You know how that goes. Mama, you're the only one for me. So mama, you can call this fund, say, support fund or random support fund. Again, as I said, a much smaller budget, say $50 a month, or that's $600 a year, depending on how you plan your finances. The point is, an emergency ought to be an absolute emergency. The woman who I mentioned earlier confused a transitional fund with an emergency fund. Transitioning to another job is not an emergency unless you just got fired instantly. A good idea is to list down a list of emergencies so you are not too surprised when these situations happen. I know it could be a taboo to list a funeral, but it is what it is. It happens. Late an emergency fund mean that an absolute emergency. Anyway, a bit of a left side story here. On the same call, the woman was advised something else. They said, don't lower your standards at work because you don't like your job. You have to smash it still. You'll be happier when it is time to leave because you've already planned it. They're still paying you, so give it 100,000%, which I thought was worth noting. You can't really give the excuse that you're leaving, therefore underperform. So My African brothers and sisters, that is a very good lesson. Anyway, please leave your comment below and do not forget to subscribe to African Boss. What do you think of emergency funds and how do you go about setting up your emergency funds? Remember, it is important to concentrate on your own financial journey with good research, and I will see you in my next video.